Okay, so the 2024 technology is fixed, so now I can talk to you about the year 1906. And a lot of modern American can be traced back to 1906. Today is Sunday, and I notice there are no men in here, it's all women. But then again, the men may be sitting in front of the TV now trying to figure out which team to bet on today in the National Football League. But in 1904 and 1905, there was a cry, let's get rid of football. It was too brutal. There was the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. Mount Vesuvius blew its top. There's Mount Vesuvius when I was there a few years ago. Blew its top. Wasn't as big as Pompeii, but it did wipe out some areas around the mountain. How many of you read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair? The Jungle was responsible for you having better food today. The Jungle was all about the meatpacking industry in Chicago and how vile it was back in those days. And that book forced Congress to change how to look at food. The Jungle from 1906. The trial of the century. How many trials of the century did you go through? In the 20th century, the trial of the century was in 1994, the O.J. Simpson trial, correct? Well, this one is Stanford White, who was killed on top of Madison Square Garden by a guy who was crazy, Harry Thal. The end of Sequoia. You ever know about Sequoia? Well, Sequoia should have been a state in the United States. It is now all of Oklahoma, but in 1905 there was a push for Sequoia to become part of the United States. Women want to vote. Susan B. Anthony died in 1906, and that was thought to be the end of the movement, the end of the women right to vote movement, but it would persist after she was dead. There was a race riot in Atlanta, a major race riot in Atlanta. The 8-hour work day. When you worked, how many hours a day did you work? 8? 8? Well, thanks to a union back in 1906, the pendulum swung and the 8-hour a day work week started. The second occupation of Cuba. You think we have problems with Cuba today? Well, that goes back to, actually it goes back to the Civil War, but this particular one goes back to 1902. Roosevelt signs an Immigration Act. Teddy Roosevelt, Statue of Liberty says come, and you can still come in 1906. That is a cartoon movie from 1906. 1906 was a really, really big year in movies. And again, the seeds are planted for the future in 1906 with people like the Warner Brothers starting to get involved with pictures in 1906. Hershey Park opens. Amusement parks were a big deal. It's one of the oldest amusement parks still going in the United States. That's me when I was 15 years old, and I'm interviewing Bob Hyland, who was with the New York Giants. That's at Spring Valley High School in March of 1972. I was in radio then. 1906, radio's first words are spoken in 1906. The flying machine patent. Finally, Wilbur and Orville Wright get a patent for their flying machine. And new words appear in 1906, and some of those words you still use today, like U-turn. Or how many of you like a banana split? Those words started to appear in 1906. Theodore Roosevelt in college football. And football is a big industry in this country, whether it's college football or National Football League. National Football League is worth billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. But in 1906, Theodore Roosevelt started banging heads together in 1905 in the Oval Office saying, look, you got to clean up this game. We had 22 people dying in 1904. Had 18 people dying in 1905 from this game. We had 40 people over the last year and a half die. You got to do something, because people are getting upset. Theodore Roosevelt threatened to ban the game in America unless new rules were implemented to make the game safer after a reported 40 players died from injuries on the field suffered in 1904 and 1905. I believe in outdoor games, and I do not mind in the least that they are rough games, or that those who take part in them are occasionally injured, said Roosevelt, who was rugged. But you're going to ban this. How do you ban a football game? How do you keep people, say, if they want to go in that parking lot and play football? Well, this is private property, but what if it was just an area, public park? How do you ban football from being played? That was a good question. The November 1905 death of Union College halfback Harold Moore, who died of a cerebral hemorrhage after being kicked in the head while trying to tackle a New York University player, became a major newspaper story. A cartoon in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune showed the Grim Reaper atop a goalpost. Theodore Roosevelt brought the presidents of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton into the Oval Office and told them, "Fix the game or else." Roosevelt hated the Harvard president, Charles Eliot. Just hated him. They were mortal enemies. Roosevelt was a Harvard guy, and he hated this president of Harvard. The Harvard contingent wanted to change football. Walter Camp and the Yale University contingent said, no, let's keep it as it is. After all, it was Walter Camp who wrote the first rules of football in 1876. This is the 12th man on the field. This guy football is watermelon shaped. It's skull and crossbones. He's got a shawl around him. On the shawl it says death. And these are players, dead players on the football field. This is called the 12th player in every game, death. Well, no one could actually figure out how to ban football. Roosevelt couldn't do it. He's president of the United States, but he just cannot ban football. But the threat of a ban made it, or at least the threat of the ban made changes in the game, or had people change rules in the game. The Roosevelt Initiative would eventually lead to the formation of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. This is 1904 action. So there was football in 1904 before a packed stadium. Columbia, Duke, Northwestern suspended their football programs. The Secretary of War, this is how high it went up in the Roosevelt administration. The Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, said he would make an example of any West Point cadet who plays rough football and have him dismissed if necessary. Get rid of football at West Point. This is how serious it was. This is Charles Eliot. He is the Harvard president. According to the New York Times, Harvard President Charles Eliot said that football was more brutalizing than prize fighting, cockfighting, or bullfighting. That's how bad it was. I demand that football changes its rules or be abolished. Change the game or forsake it. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. suffered major injuries in high school and college playing football. But Roosevelt had a soft side for football players. The Rough Riders. How many of you have heard of the Rough Riders who went up San Juan Hill in Cuba? He was the guy who's the head of the Rough Riders. And he had a soft spot in his heart. 10 of the Rough Riders, the soldiers who fought with him in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, gave their occupation when they enlisted as football players in 1898. But it was a deadly game. You can see there were no helmets there. People threw each other into each other. They smashed into each other. There's no protection for the head, none whatsoever. As a result, the American Football Rules Committee was formed beginning in January. Plays designed to open up the game and make it less dangerous to play were introduced by the committee and the members of the committee. The committee passed legislation that led to the introduction of the forward pass. You could not throw the ball forward in football. You had to fling it behind you and then run with it. Well, they figured that would make it a little safer. And the distance for first down was changed from 5 yards to 10 yards. And the thing there was, it would be harder to pick up a guy and throw him, which is what they did. They pick up a guy and throw him. You got to go 10 yards instead of 5 yards. You throw a guy, hits another guy, can break his neck, hit the ground, break his neck. More importantly, all mass formations and gang tackling were banned. This guy is named Eddie Cochems, and he's with St. Louis University. Not everyone was happy with the introduction of the forward pass in football. The East Coast top coaches viewed it as a risky gimmick. Unlike the Eastern elite coaches, the St. Louis University coach Eddie Cochems gave the new rule a try. Before the start of the season, he brought his team together at a retreat in Wisconsin for the sole purpose of studying and developing the pass. In St. Louis University's first game of the season against Carroll College, September 5th, 1906, Branberry Robinson threw the first legal forward pass. The toss hit the ground untouched, resulting in a turnover. But Robinson later connected on a 20-yard touchdown pass. Thanks in part to the forward pass, the undefeated St. Louis University team outscored its opponents 407-11, despite all the rule changes, making it safe. 11 players were killed because of the violence and brutality of the game being played. So all those rule changes really didn't matter. And you look forward, and I'll get to this a little later, 118 years later, and you know what? Those rule changes don't matter. How many of you gone to San Francisco? Nobody's gone to San Francisco here?
Nobody's what?
San Francisco. Has anybody gone to San Francisco?
No.
You have?
Yeah.
You like the city? It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful city. It's cold. It's the coldest place you're going to spend in the summer. Maybe even colder than some places in the winter. But there's a lot to do there. But the city is pretty much leveled in 1906. On April 18th at 5:12 in the morning, the city of San Francisco shook. The San Francisco earthquake was major. It had a magnitude of 7.9. The shaking was felt down in Los Angeles, 400 miles away to the south. In Coors Bay, Oregon, about 525 miles north of San Francisco. Damage was severe in San Francisco and other towns located along the San Andreas Fault, including Salinas, San Jose, and Santa Rosa. Santa Rosa is where all the wine in the United States is grown, the grapes for the wine. Most of it, I should say. Cable cars abruptly stopped, City Hall crumbled, and the Palace Hotel's glass roof splintered and littered the courtyard below. The quake was followed by a massive fire that swept from the business sector near Montgomery Street and South Market District toward Russian Hill, Chinatown, North Beach, and Telegraph Hill. That was San Francisco after the earthquake that leveled the city. The blaze continued for 4 days until its smoldering ashes were ultimately extinguished by a rain. In the process, more than 500 blocks in the city that covered about 4 square miles, and San Francisco is only 7 by 7. It's only 7 miles by 7 miles, 49 square miles, were leveled. The city the fire destroyed about 28,000 buildings, and the total property value loss was estimated at $350 million, which would be $12 billion today. It was a lot of damage. Though the quake lasted less than a minute, its immediate impact was disastrous. The earthquake ignited several fires around the city that burned for 3 days and destroyed 500 city blocks. Despite the quick response from San Francisco's large military population, the city was devastated. The earthquake and the fires killed an estimated 3,000 people and left half of the city's 400,000 residents, and that was a huge city in those days, 400,000 people out west, and out west is really out west in those days. Initially, 700 people were thought to be killed. During the disaster, it might have been double or triple of that. That's how the houses looked. They just fell backwards in San Francisco. Survivors slept in tents in city parks, and the Presidio stood in long lines for food and were required to do their own cooking in the street to minimize the threat of additional fires. Santa Rosa, Napa Valley, 55 miles north of San Francisco, the earthquake nearly destroyed the entire town. These are the papers: hundreds injured, perish in flames, great earthquakes, death and destruction sweep the Bay Cities. The Bay Cities being San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. Those are the 3 major cities in the Bay Area. Across the bay in Oakland, most of the buildings that were damaged consisted of, most of the buildings that were constructed of bricks were seriously damaged. Many of the chimneys collapsed and the water mains were broken, leaving the city without water. The 12th Street Dam was badly damaged, which broke a 20-inch water main. The biggest impact, though, was the influx of refugees from San Francisco, many who stayed in Oakland even after the area of San Francisco rebuilt. And they had to get there by boat. There was no Bay Area bridge in those days, or BART. In the 3 days following the earthquake, more than 150,000 people fled to Oakland, doubling its population in 72 hours. Do you know the way to San Jose? How many of you know the way to San Jose? Remember that song? Yeah. Well, if you go to San Jose from San Francisco, you take the 101 south. And if you go from Oakland down to San Jose, you take the 805 south. That's how you get there. But in those days, there weren't paved roads, so very few paved roads. Anyway, do you know the way to San Jose? City of San Jose, about 40 miles south of San Francisco, saw a great deal of destruction and loss of life. San Jose had about $3 million worth of damage, about $105 million today. 16 lives were lost. But San Jose was an agricultural city, and they got lucky. Because the earthquake happened in mid-April, it disrupted little in the city's growing and canning industries. Remember Steinbeck and writing about canning? Well, that was in San Jose. Leaving any damage, plenty of time to be repaired before the next harvest season. Well, the recovery. Well, that's Washington, D.C. When I was there, it was broken, the Capitol. Anyway, that was 8 years ago when they were fixing the Capitol. Congress had a quick response to the disaster. The House of Representatives and the Senate Appropriations Committee enacted emergency appropriations for the city to pay for food, water, tents, blankets, and medical supplies in the weeks following the earthquake and fire. They also appropriated funds to reconstruct many of the public buildings that were damaged or destroyed. House Claims Committee handled claims from owners seeking reimbursement for destroyed property. The committee received claims from the owners of several saloons and liquor stores whose supplies of alcohol were destroyed by law enforcement officials trying to minimize the spread of fires and the threat of mob violence. In the days following the earthquake, officials destroyed an estimated $30,000, slightly more than $1 million today, worth of booze. Think of all that booze that was destroyed. $1 million worth of booze. Can you imagine that? $1 million. Relief shipments of food and clothing reached the city, and several tens of millions of dollars in financial aid arrived from foreign sources, including England, Japan, China. China is important here. I'll tell you why in a second. And other parts of the Americas. It was time to rebuild. When you went to San Francisco, did you go to Chinatown?
No.
No, you didn't go to Chinatown? Oh, it's a great place, Chinatown. It's a really good place. It's time to rebuild, get the cable cars back going. My wife on a cable car years ago. San Francisco city officials trying to eliminate the Chinese population and export Chinatown and other poor populations to the edge of the city where the Chinese could still contribute to the local tax base. But the Chinese said, we're rebuilding. We're not moving out of here. This is our property. We're rebuilding. And something happened along the way. Because City Hall was destroyed and all the records, all of them were destroyed, thousands of Chinese immigrants claimed residency and citizenship. And that created a back door to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And they were able to bring their relatives in from China because they had no record of who was there. So Chinatown would grow because they lost all the records. Mount Vesuvius blows its stack. Anybody been to Naples? Anybody been to Pompeii? Hercules, did you like Pompeii?
Yeah.
Did you notice the phallic symbols around Pompeii? You never noticed the phallic symbols?
No, I too long ago.
Oh, okay. Well, if you go to Pompeii, on the old buildings, there were the phallic symbols. and they would be leading the way to the local brothel on the buildings. And the phallic symbols are still there to this day. Because when they dug up whatever they dug up, and they said, wow, and you found the building where the brothel was back then, because the phallic symbols would point to that building eventually. So the prostitutes, there was prostitution back in 79 AD in Pompeii. But there's Vesuvius, it flows its stack on April 5th. Yeah, and see, you didn't think this was, you see, you didn't think I'd bring up anything dirty, would you? Yeah, so anyway, you're laughing at that. So on April 5th, Mount Vesuvius in Campania erupts, killing over 100 people and ejecting the most lava ever recorded from a Vesuvius eruption. On April 10th, the lava flow from Mount Vesuvius, which almost ceased, starts again in the direction of Torre Annunziata, reaching the cemetery of that town, and then turns in the direction of Pompeii. This is Naples. And Naples is still there. Naples, one of these days, is going to get wiped out by Vesuvius. It is too close to Vesuvius. But Naples is still there, and that's a block. And yeah, it was a funny thing, when my wife and I were going through downtown Naples, I said, it's like going through when I was a kid, I grew up on the Lower East Side. Is this like going through Forsyth Street or Christie Street? Or going through Little Italy? You had the fire escapes there, and one woman would be here, yelling across the street over there to another woman on the fire escape, and they were talking to each other from their fire escapes, which must have been about 250 feet apart. And that's how they talked there. And I remember growing up, because I was on the Jewish side, which was this side of Forsyth Street, but we'd wander over there and they'd have the same conversations like they were in the old country. Italian authorities were prepared to hold the 1908 Summer Olympics in Naples when the Mount Vesuvius erupted. It devastated the province of Naples. Funds were diverted for the reconstruction of Naples, requiring a new location for the Olympics. The Olympic Committee would eventually put it in 1908 in London. Several villages and towns in the vicinity were destroyed. This eruption was notable for its dramatic lava flows, extensive damage it caused to infrastructure and agriculture, and it prompted international aid efforts. And then there were discussions. How do we respond to disasters? What do we have to do? And those discussions start in 1906, and lessons applied from 1906 apply today. And we'll see that in action if there's a major hurricane down in Florida or Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana later this week. How many of you remember the 45-star flag? No one. No one remembers the 45-star flag. It was last flown in 1906. There were only 45 states in 1905, 1906. The population of the United States, 85.4 million people. The number of stars in the American flag, 45. On December 6th, the first radio broadcast with a voice of music was aired in the United States. It featured Reginald Fessenden, live from Brant Rock, Massachusetts. He played the violin and sang the final verse of Old Holy Night and read from the passage. He claimed radio operators at sea, along with the Atlantic coast, picked up the signal. There's no evidence of it. The signal, allegedly, according to him, was received as far away as Norfolk, Virginia, which is roughly 600 miles from Brant Rock. The Jungle. Anybody read The Jungle? Upton Sinclair. Maybe the most important book of 1946, and maybe the most important book in making sure that your food today is safe, and my food today is safe. Written by Upton Sinclair. The Jungle was a novel by the American muckraker author Upton Sinclair, known for his efforts to expose corruption in government and business in the early 20th century. 1904, Sinclair spent 7 weeks gathering information while working incognito in the meat packing plants of the Chicago stockyards for the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason, which published the novel in serial form in 1905. The novel was later published in book format by Doubleday. The book depicts working class poverty, lack of social support, harsh and unpleasant living and working conditions, and hopelessness among many workers. These elements are contrasted with the deeply rooted corruption of people in power. Yeah, the Vanderbilts and those people, the Carnegies. So he's pitting the workers against the Gilded Age members. There is Upton Sinclair. The jungle caused a public uproar that contributed in part to the passage a few months later of the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act. Beginning in 1879, nearly 100 bills had been introduced in Congress to regulate food and drugs. On June 30th, President Roosevelt signed the Food and Drugs Act, simply known as the Wiley Act. Bureau of Chemistry prohibited the Bureau of Industry prohibited the interstate transport of unlawful food and drugs under penalty of seizures of the questionable products and or the prosecution of responsible parties. The Bureau's regulatory emphasis under Wiley centered on food, which he believed posed a greater public health problem than unadulterated or misbranded drugs. In other words, the food could poison you. Roosevelt was sympathetic to Sinclair's defense to regulate the industry's problems, but despised the man's zealotry. In an April 14th speech, he described muckrakers as the men who cause more trouble than they cure. In a letter to the journalist William Allen White later that summer, Roosevelt simply called Sinclair a crackpot. He's a crackpot. Why? He thought food was unhealthy and unsafe. Sensational news! How many of you watch the news and it's always sensational, particularly local news during the sweet months of May and November and February, and there's a minor sweep in July, and you'll have the local news with all these sensational reports to grab you to watch TV. Well, this one, Harry Thaw kills Stanford White in a jealous rage over actress wife, and tragic climax on rooftop before a crowd. And Thaw tells his own story of the killing of White, an insane patient fought fiercely with 3 guards. That sounds sensational, doesn't it? Very sensational. It is June 25th, and the millionaire Harry Thaw murdered famed architect Stanford White in a jealous rage over Thaw's actress wife, Evelyn Nesbit. Thaw shot and killed Stanford White in the roof restaurant of Madison Square Garden with people watching as they died. The ensuing high society trials gripped the nation's headlines for more than a year. For me, I wouldn't care, but it sold newspapers, particularly in those days. The case had all the elements a lasting true crime story required. High society, famous people, sex, jealousy, and cocaine. Thaw had an obsessive hatred of White, believing that he blocked Thaw's success to the social elite of New York. When he reached the table where White was seated, Thaw suddenly turned. Facing White, he drew a revolver, fired 3 shots, the first bullet passing through White's eye into his brain, causing instant death. The other 2 shots produced superficial wounds. Thaw immediately surrendered to an officer to whom he stated, "I killed him because he ruined my wife." Mrs. Thaw rushed up and, after embracing her husband, asked, "Why'd you do it?" He replied, "It's all right, I probably saved your life." The trial of the century would ensue. The sensational news, that's the Madison Square Garden that Stanford White originally designed way back in the late 1890s, and the statue of Diana on top of it. Basic Naturalization Act. No idiots, no criminals, or paupers. We don't want you to come in this country if you're an idiot, if you're a criminal, or you're a pauper. How do you know somebody is an idiot if they're not educated? How do you know that? What makes an idiot? And the people who are coming from Europe are probably paupers because Well, they may have been pushed out by pogroms in Russia, or maybe earthquakes devastating an area, say in Italy or somewhere else. So anyway, no idiots, no criminals or paupers. On June 29th, Congress passed the Basic Naturalization Act, established new rules and requirements for attaining citizenship, and created the Federal Naturalization Service as an agency of the Bureau of Investigation to oversee all naturalization courts and cases. President Theodore Roosevelt signed the act into law and replaced the Naturalization Act of 1870. The act required standard forms for naturalization, and the act also required immigrants to speak English to apply for naturalization. And that's, you have to learn English. And my wife's grandfather came to the country a little after that, didn't learn any English. He was a citizen, but he didn't learn any English. Whereas his wife, who ran a business in Poland, went to night school and made sure that she learned English. She wanted to be something, but in America at that time, it was very difficult for a woman to get ahead. Sequoia and Oklahoma. Gee, had things gone a different way, there might not have been a play called Oklahoma. It might have been called Sequoia. It doesn't sound, Oklahoma where the wind's, that doesn't sound as good as Sequoia where the wind comes sweeping down the plain, does it? Nah, it doesn't sound that good. On March 4th, Native American tribal governments are terminated in Indian Territory. The dissolution of the tribal governments is the first step and prerequisite for people in Oklahoma in their bid to create the state of Oklahoma. Citizens of the Indian Territory tried in 1905 to gain admission to the Union as the state of Sequoia, but they were rebuffed by Congress and an administration, Roosevelt administration, which did not want to see two new western states, Sequoia and Oklahoma. Theodore Roosevelt then proposed a compromise that would join Indian Territory with Oklahoma to form one single state. I don't know, Sequoia where the wind comes, I don't know. Sequoia, and there's Teddy Roosevelt in a museum. Sequoia and Oklahoma. This resulted in the passage of the Oklahoma Enabling Act, which President Roosevelt signed on June 16th. It empowered the people residing in Indian Territory and the Oklahoma Territory to elect delegates to a state constitutional convention and subsequently be admitted to the Union as a single state. Citizens then joined to seek admission of a single state to the Union. Women in Finland got the vote. How many of you think women should be voting? Everybody. Well, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised how many people think, yeah, well, even today, you'd be surprised. I don't know about that. Anyway, women did get the right to vote. After Russia's defeat in the war against Japan, internal political opposition against the Tsarist regime increased. Finland was part of the Soviet Union in those days. This unrest spread to Finland, where a general strike began at the end of October 1905. As a result of the unrest, the Tsar Nicholas II issued a manifesto which decreed that a parliament based on universal suffrage would be established in Finland with powers to ensure the legality of measures taken by the country's government. Finland had a great duchy, or had been a grand duchy of the Russian Empire since 1809. During that period, there was a legislative assembly called the Diet in Finland, but it had very limited powers and composed of only male representatives from upper level of society. And it got together infrequently. The voting would start in 1907. Susan B. Anthony dies in 1906. And with her death, it was thought that was it. The women's voting movement is done. It's finished. She's dead. Stanton is dead. There's nobody to take their place. Susan B. Anthony died on March 13th from heart failure and pneumonia at her Rochester, New York home. She was born in 1820 in Massachusetts. She fought for the abolition of slavery. In 1856, she served as American Anti-Slavery Society agent, making speeches, organizing meetings, and distributing pamphlets. In 1851, she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the two suffragettes, or suffragists, worked to gain independence and the equality of women for the rest of their lives. She traveled around the country advocating for women's rights and lobbied Congress. She was known, or rather Stanton was known for organizing the first women's rights convention, the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. That's a young Susan B. Anthony, as opposed to her old look. She doesn't look too bad, does she? There she is. When Stanton, the mother of 7 children, would stay home and to write and organize, Anthony, who never got married, had the freedom to travel as an activist. In 1868, she and Stanton founded the American Equal Rights Association and became editors of its newspaper, The Revolution. Anthony built subscriptions, solicited advertisements, and took copies to the printer. The paper discussed suffrage, education, marriage, divorce, equal pay, 8-hour workdays, labor, and financial policies. At this point, the suffrage movement was divided over the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments of the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment was the first mention of gender in the Constitution, granting all male citizens over the age of 21, white or black, the right to vote. The 15th Amendment stated that right to vote would not be denied due to race. The passage of both meant that black men would have the right to vote, but black women or other women of color could not vote, and obviously women couldn't vote at that time. Constitutional amendments, and this is 1868, talking about African Americans getting the right to vote. Anthony and others supported the 15th Amendment only if it included universal suffrage for all, regardless of race and gender. Stanton and Anthony disagreed and opposed the amendment, believing that if anyone deserved to vote, it was educated white women first. So here's someone who's anti-slavery, and all of a sudden, hey, you know what? If the women are to vote, it's got to be educated white women first. Though Anthony had previously lobbied for the abolition of slavery and rights of enslaved African Americans, she still adopted the racial positions, or the racist positions, by many other white women at that time to support her goal of getting women the right to vote. To focus on women's suffrage and reaction to the exclusion of women in the 15th Amendment, Anthony called together the first suffrage convention ever held in Washington, D.C. in January 1869. Then, on March 15, 1869, the first federal women's suffrage amendment was proposed in Congress for consideration. That same year, Anthony and Stanton split from other suffragettes, like Lucy Stone and Frances Ellen Watkins, and created the National Women's Suffrage Association, which opposed the 15th Amendment since it did not include gender. The National Colored Convention of 1868. Anthony adamantly continued her opposition as the editor of The Revolution. Stone, Watkins, Harper, and other suffragettes formed a rival organization called the American Women's Suffrage Association, which supported the 15th Amendment while also advocating for women's suffrage in consequent legislation. These opposing groups vied for support until the 15th Amendment was finally ratified in 1870. The NWSA then refocused its energy to push for a separate constitutional amendment aimed at specifically securing the right for women to vote. That would come 5 decades later. During the 1880s, Anthony focused on documenting the history of the movement she helped create. Recording women's history for future generations was a project that had been in the minds of Anthony and Stanton for a long time. Both looked upon women's fight for political participation as a project force in strengthening democracy and one to be emphasized in history. 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association merged with the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was advocated state by state for women the right to vote. Stanton became the first secretary of the new organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Anthony was subsequently elected president in 1892. Anthony was also instrumental in creating the International Council of Women and assisting organizing the World's Congress of Representative Women in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. Here's Stanton, here's Anthony, and with them is George Washington. They are considered, at this convention, they're considered leaders on par with George Washington. 1898, The Life and Work of Susan B. Anthony, a story of the evolution of the states of women or status of women, was published by Ida Husted Harper at Anthony's request. Anthony also created a press bureau to increase coverage of women's suffrage in the national and local press. Same year, Anthony announced her intention to retire from the National American Association. Stanton dies in October of 1902 in New York City. Anthony was ready to retire. It was time for a new generation of women. New generation of women to go out there and advocate for women's issues, for women's voting. There was nobody out there. There was nobody out there. They were the two. In 1905, she met with Theodore Roosevelt in Washington to discuss the submission of a suffrage amendment to the Constitution. She attended hearings in D.C. and gave her "Failure is Impossible" speech at her 86th birthday celebration. But there's no clear successor. She's gone as far as she could go. Stanton went as far as she could go. Who's next? Who is going to lead in the fight to get the women the right to vote in America? Well, she tries. Her name is Harriet Stanton Blanche, and she is the daughter of Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the sixth of 7 children born to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Henry Brewster Stanton. Now, there's a problem here, because in 1881, Harriet Stanton, who worked with her mother, along with Matilda Jocelyn Gage and Susan B. Anthony on the history of women's suffrage, she leaves for England. She had contributed a major chapter to the second volume in which she included the history of American Women's Suffrage Association, a rival Stanton and Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association. That helped bring those two groups together. She's gone. She marries a guy and she moves to England. And that would eventually be a problem because she would lose her American citizenship because she married a guy who was from England. Believe it or not, later in the early teens, or rather early 1900s, if a woman married an immigrant, she lost her citizenship. If a man married an immigrant, he kept his citizenship. But the woman who married the man could have been deported, could have been detained, and this would impact her later on in life, but not through 1906. In 1878, she traveled the suffrage lecture circuit with her mother, and then moved to England, where she met and married William Henry Blatch Jr. While in England, she worked with women-focused reform groups and was heavily influenced by the power of organized working classes and the militant tactics of British suffragettes. As she returned to New York in 1902, she jumped into the suffrage movement, but she was absolutely shocked. They hadn't advanced. They were still stuck in the 1890s when she left. She came back to a movement that was stalled. Well, there she is, Harriet Stanton Blatch. She's going to try to do something. She and a small group of women wanted to modernize the movement, and they realized that they had to abandon the traditional New York State Women's Suffrage Association and create their own group. Shortly after Anthony's death, Blatch began the process which would lead to the creation of the Equality League of the Self-Supporting Women, which organized suffragette parties. American Marines land at Havana, the second occupation of Cuba. You think Cuba is new? Not new. In fact, way back when, in the 1850s, there were people in Congress pushing for Cuban statehood.
they would come in as a slave state and be okay because Cuba was a slave country. They wanted Cuba as part of the United States, some of these Congress people, back in the 1850s. Well, the Spanish-American War comes along in 1898. The Americans win, and they become a colonial power. The Americans become a colonial power. They get Cuba, they get Puerto Rico, they get the Philippines, they get Guam. But they give up Cuba in 1902. But they're keeping an eye on Cuba. On October 23rd, after the government of Cuban President Thomas Estrada Parley collapsed, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt orders the U.S. military forces into Cuba. Their mission was to prevent fighting between the Cubans, to protect U.S. economic interests there, and hold free elections in order to establish a new and legitimate government. Secretary of War William Howard Taft had the establishment, the U.S. had established the U.S. provisional government on September 29th, following the government collapse. Charles Magoon was appointed as the provisional government head on October 13th. Governor Magoon nullified the December 1905 and March parliamentary elections on December 3rd. How many of you know about the Atlanta race riot? It's if you go to the Martin Luther King Center, and I've gone there twice in Atlanta, there's a big exhibit about the Atlanta race riot. Apparently, things weren't all that bad in Atlanta, considering it was the Jim Crow South, and things turned to pretty bloody one day in 1906. The afternoon is September 22nd. Atlanta papers report 4 separate assaults on white women by black men, none of which was ever substantiated by hard evidence. Inflamed by these fabrications and resentful of the city's growing African-American populations, white Atlantans riot. Over the next few days, the race massacre will claim the lives of at least 12 black Atlantans. The total may be twice as high, and it devastates the city's black community. The massacre took place against the backdrop of a heated gubernatorial primary. The Atlanta's population had doubled in the last 3 decades, and its black population went from 9,000 in 1880 to 35,000 in 1900. During Reconstruction in the late 1860s into the early and mid-1870s, African Americans participated and competed with whites for jobs, held political office, established a thriving salon society. This may have led to many whites to embrace Jim Crow and the Atlanta race riots. This is Hokie Smith. He's running for governor of Georgia. He's a racist. In the Democratic gubernatorial primary, Hokie Smith ran on a platform of explicitly disenfranchising the city's African-American population, the city of Atlanta, arguing that giving them the right to vote had led them to pursue social and economic opportunities that should only be available to whites. His opponent, Clark Howell, was not anti-segregation or pro-civil rights. He simply wanted to maintain the poll tax that was already doing enough to prevent black participation in government. In other words, let's make sure the African Americans pay to vote, and we'll charge them a good amount of money, and that'll keep them out. Although leaders of both races made attempts at reconciliation in the wake of the riot, many viewed it as proof that white Americans and white Atlantans would sooner revoke their black neighborhoods' right to vote, destroy their economic and social institutes, and murder them in the streets than allow them an equal place in society. This guy changes work conditions. His name is James Lynch. He's a union president. And James Lynch changes the way people work. He gets the 8-hour workday. The International Typographical Union President James M. Lynch decided to use strong-arm tactics and initiate strikes in most major cities attempting to secure an 8-hour workday. The union spent $4 million, which is $100 million today, $100 million to support its striking workers. Not only did the ITU win an 8-hour workday, but the ITU strike paved the way for similar gains by 5 other printing unions. They won. Responding to the demands of the typographical union, 2 major firms in the printing industry adopt the 8-hour workday. New laws are passed mandating that every contract with the U.S. government have an 8-hour day clause establishing the maximum hour for maritime workers and an 8-hour day for railroad workers. Work, 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 work. These are the guys in the Chicago meatpacking district. Arguments for reducing the work week change emphasis. Initially, the point was to reduce working hours to create jobs and reduce unemployment and to raise workers' pay. But social sciences began to argue that long hours are unhealthy, dangerous, and ultimately counterproductive. The majority of Americans in those days worked 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week. About anywhere between, say, 72 to about 78 hours. The average wage, 22 cents an hour, $7.70 today. The average worker made between $200 and $400, or today, $7,000 to $14,000. Children were expected to work, including pre-teenagers. The average school term lasted 151 days, to which the average student attended 105 days. Furthermore, very few students attended high school. In 1900, only 11% of children from age 4 to 17 enrolled in high school. Even fewer graduated. In 1900, a mere 6.3% of 17-year-olds were high school graduates. These were the living conditions. Doesn't look too much different than Naples, does it? These are the living conditions. Living conditions for many Americans were poor, especially for working class and immigrants. Overcrowding, cities were unprepared for rapid population growth. Tenements and slums were built to house the growing population. Poor sanitation. Tenements were built with cheap materials and lacked proper ventilation and indoor plumbing. Disease, the lack of sanitation and poor living conditions led to the spread of epidemic diseases like tuberculosis. Low wages, working class wages were low, provided little more than subsistence living. Limited opportunities. There were few opportunities for people to move out of city slums. Inadequate infrastructure. Cities lacked adequate water and sewer systems. Unpaved streets. Cities had unpaved streets. So what do you do in your free time? Or what do you eat for breakfast? What do you do in your free time back then? Well, the life expectancy at birth for men, 46.9 years, 50.8 years for women, about 33 for the average African American. The term filet mignon, anybody eat filet mignon in here? Filet mignon, first used by American short story writer O. Henry in The 4 Million, a collection of 15 short stories. Will Keith Kellogg launched Battle Creek Toasted Cornflake Company, aka the W.K. Kellogg Company. The company was actually started to manufacture cornflakes breakfast cereals. How many of you still eat cornflakes? Yeah, well, that's when it started. So what do you do in your free time? Well, you go to Hershey Park in 1906 or other amusement parks. People had coloring books, marbles, ping pong. There were baseball cards, jigsaw puzzles, roller skating. There were card games, singing games, and seesaws. There were also dance halls, amusement parks, vaudeville, and reading. And there were the movies. This is, Fort Lee claims they were the first Hollywood. But the first Hollywood was actually Menlo Park, New Jersey, followed by Brooklyn. But Fort Lee has their little museum about Hollywood. The first Hollywood was in New Jersey. Motion pictures were invented and produced at Thomas Edison's laboratory and studio in West Orange in 1888. The notion caught on. Vitagraph, or the American Vitagraph Studios, opened its first film studio in the U.S. It was built in Brooklyn, and for a short time, it was considered the movie capital of the world. The story of the Kelly Gang. This is thought to be the first real movie, The Kelly Gang. Nobody watched it here. And you can't watch it. It isn't together. There are bits and pieces that are still around, but most of it has been lost or dissolved. The world's first true feature-length or narrative film at 70 minutes in length. Director Charles Tate, Austrian film. The story of the Kelly Gang, also known as Ned Kelly and his gang, premiered in Melbourne, Australia, December 26th. It was the longest narrative drama seen there and in the world. The showing of the film was accompanied by an orchestra, sound effects, and a narrator. Did you watch that cartoon? In 1906, you could watch a cartoon in the movie theater. That is the first cartoon. It is called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. And it was a short, silent, animated cartoon directed by James Stewart Blackton, and it is regarded by historians as the first animated film recorded on standard picture film, debuted on April 6th. The cartoon, animated hand-drawn scenes appear on a chalkboard, including a clown playing with a hat and a dog jumping through a hoop. You want to watch that movie? Fortunately, it's only about 3 minutes long. Nickelodeon, the Palace in Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side of Manhattan. All of a sudden, these movie theaters start popping up, and it costs you a nickel to go into these movie theaters, where all of a sudden you can be entertained. Nickelodeons became the dominant exhibition outlets for the movie industry. These small, simple theaters were the first indoor spaces in the United States and Canada to show projected motion pictures. The name Nickelodeon was first used in 1888 by Colonel William Austin for his Austin's Nickelodeon, a dime museum located in Boston, Massachusetts. The term was popularized by Harry Davis and John P. Harris. On June 16, 1905, they opened a small storefront theater with the name on Smithfield Street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Others, I spelled Pittsburgh wrong, by the way. It wasn't until 1909 the H was brought back to Pittsburgh. Congress declared all cities ending in B-U-G-H had to lose the H. But Pittsburgh said, we had it way before. So they gave them back the H in 1909. Things that you learn, right? Anyway, others began operating similar venues, including William Fox, 20th Century Fox, who owned numerous theaters in New York and in New Jersey. Milton Hershey opened up his amusement park. He planned to build a park to create a more pleasant environment for workers and residents in any typical factory town of the time. Hershey Park formally opened to the public on Memorial Day, May 30th, along the banks of Spring Creek. An ideal spot for picnicking, boating, canoeing. The park was landscaped with graceful trees and wooden groves that provided a shady retreat for thousands of people without being crowded. The original main buildings, a rustic bandstand and pavilion, served as a stage for a vaudeville and theater production. This was the guy who was the first guy on radio, Reginald Festenden. On December 21st, he gave a demonstration of a new alternator transmitter at Brant Rock, Massachusetts. As part of the demonstration, his speech was transmitted 11 miles to a listening site in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Finally, the flying machine. How many of you have flown? Well, Orville and Wilbur Wright wanted to keep this thing down as much as possible because they didn't have a patent. They wanted a patent on their flying machine. The Wright brothers were granted a U.S. patent for their flying machine on May 22nd. The number, 821,393. It took the Wright brothers more than 3 years to obtain the patent. That was the originally sought in 1903. But when it was finally granted, it had what they wanted. Following the solid advice of an experienced patent attorney, Henry A. Tomlin of Springfield, Ohio. We've heard an awful lot about Springfield, Ohio in the last few days, but there's some positive there. The Wright brothers found a lawyer in Springfield. The Wrights decided to patent not just the mechanisms that allowed them to warp or flex a wing, but more importantly, to patent the idea of warping itself. The new words of the year. SOS. Is SOS a word? Not really. SOS. But anyway, here are some of the new words of 1906. SOS distress signal was selected as the worldwide standard for help. The words airplane, banana split, body shop, cookware, cordless, gag order, get up and go, holding company, microfilm, micro send, pregame, secret sauce, tightwad, town car, U-turn, and whistleblower all appear for the first time in 1906. You play Trivial Pursuit, they ask you for words that first came aboard in 1906, there are all of them. The 1906 legacy, that's me interviewing Joe Namath back in 1988 with my friend Bruce Morton. The National Football League is the king of professional sports in the United States, and college football has a substantial following. According to self-proclaimed experts, Jerry Jones' Dallas Cowboys franchise is worth about $11 billion, and the lowest rated franchise, the Cincinnati Bengals, is worth more than $5 billion. Of course, a franchise is only worth what someone is willing to pay for it. Players are still dying annually from football-related activities. Head injuries remain a problem for the industry. Since July, 11 people have died playing football or preparing for football, most of them in middle school and high school. 11 people since July. It's only in 2 months, a little more than 2 months. San Francisco Wharf there, my friend Jeff Beeren, my wife, and me eating on the wharf. The California earthquake of April 18th, 1906, ranks as one of the most significant earthquakes of all time. On October 17th, 1989, the Loma Prieta Bay Area earthquake caused 63 deaths, 3,800 injuries, estimated $6 billion, $15 billion today in property damage. It was the strongest earthquake to hit the area since the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. The 1914 South Napa earthquake occurred in the North San Francisco Bay Area. That was August 24th at 3:20 in the morning Pacific time. The event was the largest in the San Francisco Bay Area since the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. The epicenter of the earthquake was located to the south of Napa and to the northwest of American Canyon on the West Napa Fault. Total damage in the southern Napa Valley and Vallejo areas was in the range of $362 million to $1 billion. Today, $476 million to $1.3 billion. 1 person killed, 2,000 injured. There is Vesuvius again. Now I should put up a picture with the phallic symbol. Anyway, during the final years of World War II, Vesuvius erupted once more. That would be in 1944. The eruption had a significant impact on the ongoing war efforts as it disrupted transportation and communication networks in the region. The eruption created a spectacle of fire and ash that contrasted with the broader global conflicts of the time. There have been no eruptions since 1994, and none of the eruptions after AD 79 were as large or destructive as the Pompeian one. Upton Sinclair. His original intent for the jungle was to call attention to horrible working conditions of men, women, and children in the Chicago packing houses. The jungle was influential in obtaining passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Sinclair was a racist, he was an anti-Semite, he was also a political activist. He was the 1934 Democratic Party nominee for the governor of California. He wrote about 100 books and other works. In 1943, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his work in fiction, Dragon's Teeth. Injustible, or justable, act of an insane man, Harry Thaw. Harry Thaw was tried twice for the murder of Sanford White. Due to the unusual amount of publicity the case received, it was ordered that jury members be sequestered. The trial proceedings began January 23, 1907. The jury went into deliberation on April 11th. After 47 hours, the jurors were deadlocked. Second trial took place from January through February 1st, 1908. At the second trial, Thaw pleaded temporary insanity. Thaw was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sentenced to incarceration for life. On July 16, 1915, another jury determined Thaw was no longer insane and set him free. Fidel Castro. The United States and Cuba share a long, complex history, first as allies, trade partners, later as bitter ideological enemies. After America helped Cuba break free from Spanish rule in 1898, the U.S. government continued to intervene militarily, and American businesses continued to invest economically, while U.S. mobsters made the island their money laundering playground. After the Cuban Revolution installed a stringent socialist regime in 1959 and nationalized U.S.-owned businesses, relations quickly soured. By 1960, Fidel Castro had kicked all American business out, and the two countries have been fighting since then. That is the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. The discussions of the violence of the Atlanta race riot were avoided and suppressed. For decades, there was no mention of it in Atlanta public schools. Atlanta's African community was economically devastated. The massacre traumatized Atlanta's black community, reinforced segregation in the city, and hastened a more activist approach to civil rights, leading to the formation of the NAACP in 1909. The Ku Klux Klan formed in nearby Stone Mountain, Georgia in the mid-19 teens. It took years for thriving black neighborhoods to be rebuilt and businesses to be reestablished. Helsinki! It always rains in Helsinki. On March 15th and 16th, 1907, history was made in towns and rural hamlets of Finland. In the national election held those 2 days, every citizen 24 and over was allowed to vote. Not all American women got the right to vote in 1920. In 1920, Native Americans were not allowed to vote in the United States as they were not citizens. So that amendment didn't appeal to them. With the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, American-born Native women gained the right to citizenship. There was also voter suppression of the women vote through poll taxes and other tactics. That is the Barrymore Theater. It is where the history of Fort Lee in the movies is kept. By 1908, there were about 8,000 Nickelodeon theaters across the country. With the arrival of the Nickelodeon audience, demand for a larger quantity of story films with a variety of subjects and locations led to a need to hire more creative talent and caused the studios to invest in more elaborate stage designs. In 1908, Thomas Edison led the creation of the Corporation Trust between the major film companies in America, known as the Motion Picture Patents Company, to limit infringement on his patents. By 1915, the MPPC lost most of its hold on the film industry as the companies moved toward wider production of feature films. The film industry would find cheap land in the Los Angeles area. That land is today known as Hollywood. The land was cheap and the climate was good. That is Tivoli in Copenhagen. Tivoli Gardens is the most visited attraction in Denmark. Third most visited amusement park in Europe. The park was built by George Cartensen, opened August 15th, 1843. Tivoli is the second oldest amusement park behind another one called Deer Park in the world. Hershey Park is the 42nd oldest amusement park in the world. That is the Space Shuttle Discovery. That's a museum outside of Dulles Airport in Virginia. After several unsuccessful attempts on December 17, 1903, at Kill Devil Hills near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright completed the first power flight of a heavier-than-air aircraft known as the Wright Flyer. In 1969, Apollo 11 astronaut Neil A. Armstrong took with him a piece of wood from Wright's Flyer's left propeller and a piece of Muslim fabric from its upper left wing to the moon. John Glenn took different pieces of the Wright Flyer when he returned to space aboard the Discovery in 1998. A piece of the Wright Flyer was placed in the rover that landed on Mars on February 18th, 2021. Oh, there's my old Grundig radio. Whatever happened to radio? Anybody listen to WCBS AM News Radio 88? Yeah, it's gone. It's gone. AM radio in this country is almost gone. Radio is losing money. The CHML in Hamilton, 900 on the dials, gone. They just shut it down. WFAS, gone in White Plains. WVOX, New Rochelle, gone. That's how bad the radio industry is. AM stations have gone off the air in various markets. WFAS, White Plains. The AM band barely clings to life with suggestions that the band should just disappear. Radio stations used to be considered real estate. Not anymore. Most radio stations have little value. Odyssey dumped the WCBS news radio format and rented the 880 frequency in New York to ESPN in a cost-cutting measure in August 2024. WCBS was taking in about $30 million a year in advertising. CHML 900 in Hamilton, Ontario also went dark in August 2024. Radio can be available in an emergency with valuable information, unlike modern technology such as this, which depends on cell towers. They depend on basically a generator and a tower. And you can get a generator, and stations have stayed on the air during blackouts, during hurricanes, during earthquakes, because it's radio. It's so easy. It's not like a network TV production, which Howard Cosell once said. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to talk. I've done too much talking.